Welcome to Introduction to Photoshop CC for Planners. In this video, we're going to talk about working with gradients in Photoshop. To work with gradients, we're going to use the gradient tool, which is keyboard shortcut G. Let's talk about a few different kinds of gradients that you can use in Photoshop. To see the different kinds of gradients, select your gradient tool, and you'll see the option bar here at the top, update with the options for that tool. There are 5 different kinds of gradients in Photoshop. They all look a little different, but function the same way. The 5 types are linear gradient, radial gradient, angle gradient, reflected gradient, and diamond gradient. Let's talk about the gradient editor. Creating a basic gradient in Photoshop works the same no matter which type you've selected. It'll use your foreground and your background color to determine the colors that are used in the gradient. Let's create a basic light blue to dark blue gradient. We'll choose linear as our type. I'm going to click once, drag in the direction I want the gradient to go, and then release, and it'll draw my gradient. Notice how it went from my foreground to my background color. My foreground being the light blue, so I clicked on top, and then I clicked to the bottom, to my dark blue, and that determined the direction of the gradient. I could create a gradient in the opposite direction where the light blue is on the bottom by clicking on the bottom and dragging up first. Let's try the same colors but with the different gradient types. Here's the radial gradient. I'll click the middle, which will mean the light blue, to the dark blue on the edges. Here's the angle gradient. The reflected gradient, and the diamond gradient. How far the foreground to the background color fades, the length of that fade, is determined where you click. So notice I clicked in the center here, and then here's my edge, and so this final edge is where the color fully blends into the background color. If I click and drag to the edge here, the darkest part, my background color, will be all the way at the edge, and the gradient will go from the center all the way to the edge. You can also create more complex gradients using the Gradient Editor panel. Bring up the Gradient Editor panel, click on the gradient colors. The Gradient Editor comes with its own preset gradients. Some of these I'd recommend avoiding. They're pretty garish though. You can set your own gradients and name them here. You can also find additional presets in the panel menu drop-down. An important piece of understanding how custom gradients work are called color stops. So the gradient we just created using those light blue and dark blue had 2 color stops. In the case that's shown on the screen here, there are 3 color stops. There's also what's called the midpoint. Let's go over how to work with them. So here we have the gradient we drew earlier with our light blue foreground fading up to our dark blue background at the top. We can just redraw that again. So light blue at the bottom, dark blue at the top. And let's go back to our gradient editor, and you can see here, here's my light blue. I can just click on the color stop, there it is. I can click on the dark blue color stop here. Here's my midpoint. And so you can see how I adjust that. It'll adjust where that halfway transition point between the light blue and the dark blue is. So the closer I move here, the shorter the gradient is of the light blue point. Let's set that back to 50%. Now if I want to add a third color between these, all I have to do is click underneath and it adds an additional color stop. Now here in the case it defaulted to my background dark blue color. I'm going to click on that, and now I can select a different color. Let's do something dramatic. Let's select a pretty bold color like a bright orange, just so that it's clear where the gradient is. So it's showing up here in my preview. Here's my new color stop with the orange. Here are my midpoints. So it's just halfway between the orange and the dark blue, halfway between the light blue and the orange on this side. And let's just hit OK and redraw our gradient. So I'm going to start at the bottom and go to the top. And now you can see the gradient between the 3 colors. Makes for a very different image. We can go and add an additional color just by clicking on our gradient, clicking underneath here, and adding another color stop. I picked a bright red. I'm going to redraw it, and you can see that additional color coming through. Another feature of gradients in Photoshop is that you can add transparency directly to the gradient. And this is done through the opacity stop. So not only can you have multiple colors in your gradient, but you can also have multiple levels of opacity. To demonstrate opacities in gradients in Photoshop, I'm going to add an additional photo here and move it behind my gradient layer. You can see that the gradient we've drawn previously is at 100% opacity, meaning you can't see anything behind it. Now I can adjust the opacity for the entire layer and start to see the photo behind it. However, we have even greater control over our opacities within our gradients through our gradient editor. So I'm going to use this same color scheme here, but add different levels of opacity. So I'm just going to go and add these opacity stops on the top here. Right now they're all at 100%, but I'm going to set this one to be opacity 20, and this one to be leave at 100, and then this one to be back to 20%. So what this means is that it's fully at 100% opacity on the light blue, meaning you shouldn't be able to see anything at the very bottom of the image. It'll gradually fade to 20% opacity at the orange, back to 100% at the red, and back to 20. So it'll be obscured here. You'll be able to see 20% of the image here, back to 100% here, and then back to 20% here. So let's hit OK. We're going to turn off our gradient, create a new layer, and draw that gradient back in. So from the bottom to the top, holding Shift, and there you can see the multiple opacities within my gradient. Compare that to our 100% gradient. So that was a quick review of working with gradients, including working with transparencies and gradients in Photoshop. Thanks for watching.